So yeah, we're talking about The Righteous Mind, published by Jonathan Haidt in 2012. He'd been working in this area for a good number of years leading up to that with various sort of academic colleagues and so forth. We'll talk a bit about the kind of the moral context, if you like, framing some of this work, and then we'll go into the thinking in the book and sort of layer that up, and then we've got some sort of examples and so forth, just to sort of bring it to life a bit more before sort of concluding it at the end. So I mean, let me just see if I can actually, yeah, okay, lovely. So moral values. I mean, arguably, becoming kind of increasingly salient, it feels like sometimes in our landscape, and I mean, if you look at the sort of kind of Partygate at the moment and the last 2 years of COVID, this kind of sense of the kind of moral psychology of our context has been very, very sort of felt in a way. And there are another sort of longer term trends perhaps sort of pointing to this, whether it's around kind of a de-alignment and distrust, really. So some of those traditional political bonds breaking down, and many people no longer sort of strongly aligned to mainstream parties. There have been examples, some very major examples, where values have perhaps trumped economics. Values more than traditional economic self-interest have been driving kind of voting behaviour, as we've seen over the last few years. What we call the graduate factor. So, for example, if you look at something like Brexit, the biggest single background factor shaping the differences between Leave and Remain was whether or not you went to university, a more significant factor than income, than social class. And arguably an important part of that is the kind of liberalising cultural effects of university, very key in shaping people's values. The so-called Great Divide, which is talked about in so many different ways, but coming back to that idea that there are these different sort of value sets that are underpinning the political landscape that has been revealed by Brexit, which obviously was a while ago, but we are, as Caroline said, really we're still living in what could be called Brexit land, and that kind of map of the country, and all these perhaps pointing to the idea that there are different kind of moral value sets, different moral tribes even coalescing around these quite divergent value sets that define them. And so it's useful to have a framework that helps us kind of try and make sense of these changes, and think also about, what are the kind of core morals or values? What's the moral psychology that's kind of going on here that's maybe structuring some of our reactions and some of our beliefs and so forth? And, it's a funny thing perhaps, but qualitative researchers, maybe we're a bit amoral in some of our thinking. We do occasionally talk about ethics, but doesn't feel like moral psychology has really kind of been talked about a great deal so far in the industry, and perhaps it's been a little bit neglected in qualitative research. And maybe we need to remind ourselves that, the heart of every person is this kind of moral self, this moral animal that is making, intuitive judgments based on just what you feel is right or wrong, in your sort of sense of fairness and justice and so forth. So it's useful to have a framework that helps us kind of understand that moral landscape and helps us navigate those moral values and think about how these values might shape some of our kind of core ideas about what's desirable in society, what kind of society we want to be part of, and the behaviour of others, and how we judge that. And so, with Jonathan Haidt's and his colleagues' work, they developed a framework, moral foundations theory, which The Righteous Mind is all about, that theory, basically, and very well described in that book. And moral foundations theory, so it's a social psychological theory intended to explain the origins of moral reasoning. And it explains them on the basis of innate intuitive foundations. So these are kind of deeply rooted in our evolutionary past. And the theory proposes 6 foundations. So here they are, and we're going to be going into all of these later on. Each one has its kind of moral opposite. So care, harm, fairness, cheating, and so forth. And we just want to talk a bit now about, well, where does this thinking come from? A bit about the sort of the backstory, if you like, which is important to know about sort of Jonathan Haidt and where his thinking kind of evolved from. So he is one of the leading sort of thinkers in moral psychology, and he does bring some very sort of important experiences and attributes. In terms of what he says in the book, he feels that there has been a liberal bias, if you like, in moral psychology, which has partly been driven by a sort of justification of a secular liberal outlook that saw parents or authority as sort of obstacles to self-development, to moral development. And this very weird, in terms of the weird countries, this individualistic model of Western definitions of justice, if you like, that's dominated the field. And Haidt spent a lot of time researching in other cultures. And he's also the co-founder of the Heterodox Academy, which is about improving the quality of education in universities by increasing viewpoint diversity. So he's very intentional in the way he tries to step outside of his own sort of echo chamber, as it were, and look at how different cultures see things. And his thinking's really helped us understand how the moral domain varies across different cultures and varies across different social classes. Non-Western cultures can inhabit a different kind of moral framework to the rest. Lower class groups can moralize in different ways, children more than adults and so forth. So this moral domain varies across these different cultures. And Haidt's research just helps us kind of acknowledge also how we have our own moral biases, and enhances our kind of understanding that there are alternative moral frameworks that are not our own, and his thinking in the book really helps to sort of broaden that understanding, which arguably is very important in terms of the age we're living in, where you can get these quite binary situations where one side just doesn't get the other side because they're just coming from a different sort of set of values. Just in terms of layering up the thinking, so morality starts very young, from early childhood, that sense of something not being fair, and how quickly we're able to make, these rapid moral intuitions at an early age. Various experiments are talked about in the book. There's an experiment with 6-month-old babies watching puppets either helping or hindering each other, trying to fulfill a task. And the babies were able to discern between the helpful and unhelpful, and instinctively choosing the helper. So in a sense, even babies can make relatively sophisticated moral judgments about the social world. Sharing plays a big role in the moral lives of children, and dividing things equally. 4 kids have 12 jelly beans, each could get 3, and so forth. But what do kids do when the jelly beans are a reward for clearing up the classroom, for example? And one kid did most of the work and one did almost nothing. But and even toddlers seem to recognize the importance of what's called proportionality, the reward corresponding to the work. So in one experiment, again mentioned in the book, 2-year-olds showed signs of being surprised when 2 people were rewarded equally, when only one of them did any of the work. So even by the age of 6, kids show a clear kind of preference for rewarding the hard worker in a group, even when sort of equal pay, if you like, is an option, and so forth. So he proposes that we kind of instinctively begin to understand, the basic moral landscape of our social world before we can speak, even before we can really reason. And that sense of fairness is very intuitive, and starts at that kind of early age in terms of things like getting the reward we deserve, develops early on, and so forth. Haidt is very much a kind of advocate of, system 1, system 2, the sort of elephant and the rider metaphor, and so forth. So another key kind of building block to his thinking is that, moral judgments are very fast and instinctive, and very reliant on are made by the elephant, essentially. People make them emotionally, immediately. They're often sort of almost triggered in that way. They're very rapid and compelling kind of intuitions, and then we'll sort of think of justifications afterwards to justify our gut feelings, our kind of rationalizations, as it were. So those intuitions, those instincts come first, and then that sort of strategic reasoning sort of follows on, and so forth. and we're not very good at seeking out evidence that sort of maybe disconfirms our initial moral judgments. So we can become quite morally biased and sort of judgmental in a way. Just as we're biased in other ways, we can also be morally biased. But those original emotional triggers to our moral intuitions are very powerful. The reason why they're very powerful, so the book argues, is because they are rooted in our evolutionary past, but they're still triggered in our culture today. But in terms of our evolutionary past, the book argues that morality is essentially, it's innate. So it stems from a set of evolved tuitions. And, you know, as children, we learn to sort of apply those tuitions within our particular culture at the time. But our emotional responses are shaped by evolution. They're a response to adaptive challenges. And these are the kind of original triggers of our moral judgments. So, for example, you know, caring for infants is a very sort of clear and obvious one. But we're also influenced by our culture today, and emotional responses are then shaped by that cultural context. And these become the current triggers of our moral judgments. So it's this combination of evolution and culture and the interplay of the two. Our moral intuitions originally rooted in our evolutionary past, but they are still triggered and applied in our culture today. Just in terms of another sort of building block behind the thinking, before we get into the framework and the foundations themselves, Haidt very strongly argues that morality is something that binds and blinds. It's a kind of key phrase he uses throughout the book. Morality binds us into groups, and it correlates with our political identities as well. So, you know, moral reasoning is almost, its overall purpose is to help us pursue group goals, and it plays an important role in providing social glue that kind of regulates relationships and cooperation within tribes, between people. And we will try and maintain appealing moral identities in front of others, and we will signal to others our moral virtues to let them know that, you know, we are okay, we are good. And in moral matters, we are often more group-based, more tribal, rather than purely selfish. And where we really see this tribal aspect of moral values is then, he argues, in terms of political beliefs. And those political beliefs are based on our kind of moral bedrock and moral intuitions. And the sensitivity to the different moral foundations, which we'll come on to in a second, correlates with political ideologies. So liberals will tilt towards certain moral foundations, conservatives will tilt towards other moral foundations, and they will see these different moral foundations in quite different terms. We'll obviously come on to some examples in a second, but this identification with our kind of group based on values and differentiation from the out-group then leads to kind of that prejudice, that animosity, and so forth. And the fact that these moral judgments are so emotionally loaded and emotionally triggered, because they're deeply rooted in the evolutionary past, leads to, you know, that increased favoritism towards our group and a kind of greater negative stereotyping of the out-group. So we are often blind to the alternative moral viewpoints that are outside our own moral tribe. Okay, we just don't get them, we don't understand where they're coming from, and so forth. So in this sense, morality binds us into groups, and it blinds us to the different moral perspective that other groups may have, and we just see them as, well, you know, plain wrong, or there's something you know, pathological about them, and so forth. The difference between, just putting it into the sort of current context a little bit, the difference between sort of leave and remain value sets are, you know, have some, in a way, some help to bring some of this to the surface in terms of our political culture. So the book itself is based in you know, it's obviously written from a kind of US point of view. So it's about the differences between conservatives and liberals in the US. And here we're kind of really mapping it across the kind of leave remain value sets that have been, you know, revealed by Brexit, and a really defined kind of Brexit land, if you want to see things in those terms. But the fault lines that lie underneath them, you know, do run deep in our kind of social substructure of where people live and their generation and their educational background and that political landscape. And they will view themselves positively, the other side negatively, and this identity is still there as an important sort of, or the values that underpin the identity are still there as an important kind of perceptual filter and evaluation bias. But each camp, if you like, tilts towards certain moral values, and each is kind of blind to the morality of the other. So if you go into the bullseye of these two camps, they just won't kind of get the other side in that sense. And the argument is that the emotional power of these moral judgments is, part of what is behind the kind of the sense of polarization that we're seeing or we have seen in our political culture. And these political identities have revealed those strong emotional attachments towards those kind of value sets and that kind of moral tribe and so forth, just to put it into that context. So quick recap of where we are. In the book, as it were. So, we're innately moral animals. We're shaped by this combination of evolution and culture. Morality it's the elephant and the rider. It's intuitive, it's fast, it's emotionally triggered and compelling. And we care about our moral reputations with others. It's important glue in all of our social relationships. So we are very tribal about moral matters. It binds us together in groups. And our sensitivities towards the different foundations correlates with political beliefs, and we can be unaware of alternative moral views on that basis. So morality blinds in that way. So we have a kind of framework to help us kind of organize this thinking. And there's a lot of stuff on this slide, but this is the kind of summary table of the foundations kind of on a plate, as it were. And this is the framework that Jonathan Haidt developed to help us navigate this landscape. So just in terms of this table, there are 6 key moral foundations that define our range of moral intuitions. Each foundation has its immoral opposite. They can overlap and they vary in strength from person to person and culture to culture, and sometimes, time related and so forth. They can be activated in different contexts. And arguably some of these have been very strongly activated in the kind of whole COVID context and so forth. But the idea is that we as people we've got all these inside us. We are multiple from the start. So they're all kind of inside us, and our minds have the potential to become moral about many different concerns, but only a few of those concerns are activated via whatever it may be, our background, our childhood. Other latent concerns may develop later on and so forth. So what we want, and just in terms of this table, we have, so if you look at care harm, you've got the first row, you've got the adaptive challenge, the evolutionary challenge that this foundation stemmed from was protecting, caring for children. And you've got those original triggers, the distress or neediness expressed by a child. You've got some suggested current triggers in our current culture that could trigger this care harm foundation, victims or the vulnerable or baby seals, and some of the key emotions that are associated with it. And then at the bottom row, some of the virtues, caring and kindness, that are also associated with that foundation. So we'll just look at each foundation in turn and sort of bring them to life and sort of dive into. So I'm really going to focus on care, harm, and fairness cheating in a bit of depth, and then just very summarize the other ones. The care harm foundation. So parents who are innately sensitive to signs of suffering and distress improved our evolutionary odds, and thank God they did. Otherwise, we know we would all be dead. But Remainers or liberals rest heavily on this care harm foundation and tend to extend it to universal humanity. Leavers or conservatives are more activated by people, within the group. So who we extend our care to really does is such a key fault line and does very much define the difference between Leave/conservative and Remain/liberal identities. It will cut across things like attitudes to foreign aid or benefits, access to the NHS, what kind of charities you donate to. There are different hierarchies of deserving recipients of care. Some are universal, others are conditional. Who we see as vulnerable or as a victim is also obviously a critical question. This foundation is applied to groups who are seen as vulnerable, children being the key group, but could be to others as well. it can also apply to things, the environment, for example, and so forth. So whoever they are, this foundation means that we have a tendency to react emotionally to them as if we are parents caring for children. And that's important because this foundation is very powerful. It really activates that protective parent instinct, and that parental care trigger can be very powerful. If it's activated, we can interpret any challenge as a kind of mortal threat or danger, and our response can therefore be very absolute, very uncompromising, and so forth. So that explains perhaps some of the heat and the passion that's underneath this foundation when it is triggered. Fairness Cheating Foundation, really interesting one, to be honest. So our ancestors have faced the challenges of, reaping the rewards of cooperation. So we all are getting along, we're all cooperating, and reciprocity without getting cheated or suckered. And the whole sort of territory of fairness is such a kind of political battleground. It's so hotly contested, and it is constantly fought over. And there are so many different interpretations. Whether is fairness about equality of outcome? Is fairness about contribution-based fairness? Is it about equality of opportunity, and so forth? And there's quite a long list of ways you can define fairness. Left-wing or liberal fairness is traditionally more about ensuring equality of outcome and social justice. Conservative fairness is more about proportionality, fairness based on your contribution and so forth. And in quotes, free riders can be judged by conservatives accordingly. And one of the reasons why it's such a hotly contested area is because this kind of tension that exists around reciprocity. There's this constant suspicion that we've, in our sort of DNA, if you like, this constant concern that we will be cheated. And this tension in reciprocity is between, and again, it's a lovely, I really like this idea in the book, this, you got the elephant and the rider metaphor, but I love this selfish chimp cooperative being. This tension in reciprocity is between our self-interested and our cooperative instincts, which we all have. We are both selfish chimp and cooperative bee. And these two instincts are at work simultaneously within us. And just think about your work and your colleagues, and are they more selfish chimp or are they more cooperative bee, and so forth. Might be a fun game, but these two instincts are at work simultaneously within us. Individuals compete with individuals, and we are selfish in that way, but the reality is cohesive and cooperative groups did better in evolutionary terms and beat outsiders. So we're not always selfish, we have to cooperate, and we're able to switch on that cooperation and using reciprocity for the good of the group, behaving like the cooperative bee. But like our ancestors, we are also kind of programmed to be on the lookout for cheaters and and free riders and so forth, and have these kind of suspicious faculties that are scanning for that kind of thing. And there's this sort of constant concern that reciprocity will break down, and we will be suckered or cheated or conned in some way. Because cheating lets us sort of reap the rewards of cooperation, but avoid the costs, essentially, because we can free ride on whatever it is. Our brains have adaptations to help us avoid norms and to cheat as well. So we are partly programmed to cheat, but we're also programmed to use our suspicious minds to detect cheaters and be on the lookout for free riders. And the free rider problem is something that Jonathan Haidt talks about quite a lot in the book, and it arises when people think we think people who are benefiting from resources or public goods are cheating. We think they don't pay for them or they misuse them, resulting in scarcity and under-provision. Perceived free riding, causes a lot of anger and resentment, particularly when in the context of scarcity and feeling that there aren't enough resources to go around, and you might be personally struggling and so forth. So social trust and cohesion plays such an important role in underpinning reciprocity, and our willingness to kind of contribute, to be the cooperative bee, to contribute to collective resources is based on trust. And if trust levels are low, and we suspect free riding or cheating, we are less willing to pay in. And the less solidarity we feel with others, the less willing we might be to pay into collective resources, whether it be things like, the welfare state, NHS, and so forth. Again, the sensitivity towards cheating is even sharper in the context of scarcity, personal scarcity, and what you might see as societal scarcity that many, may have been perceiving or feeling, and so forth. And this sort of pervading suspicion that others or the them are taking advantage of us and the system. We've seen it in so many different shapes and forms. Benefits cheats, as some people have called certain groups. Firmly held belief amongst some that that's the norm, and a real resentment for those that are working and, in their words, contributing while still struggling in a situation of scarcity. It could be the taxation system, that strong sense of unfairness. You're penalised for working harder whilst the rich are always getting away with it. And the kind of, again, the corporate villains that some people kind of characterise, around corporate cons and loopholes and so forth. And of course, as we know, corrupt political elites and the news right now, absolutely, another layer of cynicism on top of that kind of anti-politician kind of attitude that so many people hold, commonly viewed as cheating or corrupt. One rule for them and another rule for us, and just self-serving and so forth. And people, again, can become less and less willing to put into the collective pot as cooperative bees when trust and solidarity feel low. And the importance of contribution-based fairness, getting out what you put in, kind of is dialed up and increases. So I spent a lot of time on fairness and cheating, but it's such a battleground. So we move on to the other foundations, and I'll sort of be a bit briefer with these. The Loyalty Betrayal Foundation is a very interesting one, and it's conservatives and kind of leavers as well. So they kind of tilt quite heavily towards loyalty betrayal, and your kind of liberals less so. Liberal and Remain loyalties tends towards universalism and away from sort of nativism or nationalism. And as a result, they can struggle to connect with some, working class voters who can rely more on this sort of loyalty foundation. But this betrayal can be a very big theme, and it's been a big theme in our culture at different times, as you can see from this kind of media coverage. And it is a powerful foundation that should not be underestimated. And I sort of dragged up some more examples off Google, of course, where you've just got these kind of manifestations. I mean, you can usually rely quite well on the Daily Mail to come out with a betrayal headline every so often, but just other examples and so forth that you can see here, where in the language that they're using, at least it kind of almost signals that yes, this foundation has been triggered in that way, as well as the Care Harm Foundation. The government not looking after its people, triggering that kind of care harm foundation as well in this context, arguably. Authority subversion. This is a complex foundation that looks in two directions, at those in authority and at subordinates. And subordinates can defer respect for authority and trust in their competence, whilst the authorities are taking that pastoral responsibility for subordinates, whilst they're looking after the population, the state looking after its people and keeping them safe. And we've heard a lot about that over the last couple of years. But the legitimacy and credibility of those in authority, as we know, can be undermined and has been undermined, and so forth. So the subordinates, many can demand, the will of the people must be carried through, but they can also recognise their own limitations of their own sort of capacity, and that they themselves are kind of insufficient, and they want authority and the experts, the parents, to do their job and to take control in a way. And again, I think, we've seen this. I mean, that Michael Gove quote's very old, but now haven't experts changed in such a huge way under the course of the pandemic, where we are all looking to authority to take on its pastoral responsibilities, to look after the people, to keep them safe, and to follow the experts and follow the scientists, and even the governmental authorities are following the experts and claim to be following the science and so forth in that way. So perhaps you can see this foundation again, re-triggered in the kind of COVID context and so forth, and manifesting itself in an interesting way. A couple more foundations to cover off. So sanctity and degradation. This is an interesting one again, because underneath this one, it sort of taps into a sort of disease response. I mean, it's really getting quite biological in that way, but in terms of its origins. But sanctity, degradation. So something is so sort of polluted that we stay away, and we recoil in disgust. I mean, we recoil physically. We don't recoil physically just to sort of something that is materially polluted, something that we see as somehow, as we define it, morally polluted. We will recoil physically and recoil in disgust. Yeah, I don't know, incest, for example. It's so, or something is so sacred that we protect it from desecration, and we regard it as untouchable. And the psychology of sacredness perhaps helps sort of bind people into moral communities. And when someone challenges or attacks, their sacred objects of the community, that can be religious, they can be secular, the reaction can be very swift, can be very punitive. And again, this can apply to, non-religious objects or institutions. And, the NHS, for example, and this is the picture of the NHS there is in the Olympics opening ceremony, but we have been, that sort of almost sacred status of NHS workers and the NHS as an organisation. Again, in the last couple of years, arguably that's just been elevated even more with all the sort of clapping for the NHS and obviously all the heroic work that they've been doing. And again, that also relates to that care harm foundation, which is a powerful foundation that the NHS have been sort of caring for us in this way. So this idea of sacred objects that are beyond question, beyond criticism, and so forth, you can arguably apply them to all sorts of non-religious contexts. It's that idea of sanctity versus degradation. Final one, foundation, the liberty oppression foundation. And there is a heavy reliance on this foundation when people talk about things like, social justice, for the underdog, for the victims or the vulnerable, or, powerless groups, if you like. And it can also bring out, again, the care harm foundation. So you can have multiple foundations can be triggered, and bring out the care harm foundation where you want to protect the victim like you would your own child, as it were, and therefore it's triggering these incredibly strong, sometimes uncompromising kind of protective instincts of the parent that kind of emotionally fuels the whole sort of thing, as it were. Remember, I'm putting this together, this isn't something I actually mentioned in Jonathan Haidt's book, but Trevor Phillips, the former chair of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, has even proposed, it's the interesting idea that, as he put it, the left's energy for social justice that used to be used in defense more of the kind of traditional working class has now been transferred into identity politics and the protection of minorities who are seen as oppressed and vulnerable groups and so forth. The left obviously lean heavily on this foundation, and again, it can also trigger that kind of that strong caring instinct of the parent, which kind of explains again some of the kind of emotional heat that can be around this sense of sort of social justice and so forth. So, just to sort of summarize and wrap up, as it were, the book really does suggest that, fundamentally we're all moral animals, and that, moral psychology is really the kind of the bedrock of where we're coming from, particularly in our sort of political attitudes, and it can be used in some of the stuff we just talked about, the public sector, perhaps also in the sort of commercial world as well, particularly in the last 2 years, where the sort of behavior of brands in COVID and have they been helping or have they been taking advantage or whatever they've been doing, but there is a heightened moral atmosphere that is setting the context perhaps for which brands have been judged in the last couple of years. So it does have sort of some application in the kind of commercial world, and the idea of, as well as just the idea of the moral economy. and the idea of just being cheated by a company, cheated by a brand, and so forth. Or if you feel like you've been a loyal customer, but it's always the new customers to get the deal, is that triggering the sort of loyalty betrayal sort of foundation there, and which kind of explains why some customers get really, really angry that they've been with you for 5 years, but it's new customers who get the best deal and you're still paying over the odds. Why are they so angry about that? It can't be purely for the sake that they're paying an extra, 25 quid or whatever it is. So just this idea that we need to build, this sort of moral and value-based thinking maybe more into our work, and it could be a sort of useful idea for us to adopt and so forth. And back to this framework, these 6 foundations and so forth. And interesting to talk about, well, which ones resonate with us perhaps, or what sort of moral tribe do we belong to, and so forth. And just a sense of, I suppose as qualitative researchers, fundamentally our job is often understanding people who are not like us. And therefore it's important to have these frameworks that do help us understand those different or alternative moral perspectives that might be a bit distant from our own, but are nevertheless coming from a moral place, as it were. So that concludes the presentation, but I'll sort of leave this slide up here, I guess.